Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Van. I'll be acting as the moderator today, but I'll also be participating in our conversation. Before we get started, and as people join the webinar, I just want to go through a few housekeeping details. So we are recording the webinar today. So for those that are unable to join, or if you have to leave for any reason, you will receive a follow-up email, and that'll have the recording in it, and that'll come in the next few days. Also, during our discussion, we are going to reserve time at the end today, hopefully around 15 minutes, where we'll have a Q&A session. Um, in order to participate in that, there is a little Q&A button at the bottom. So you can submit your questions in that section, and we'll go through them at the end and try to answer as many of those questions as we can live during the conference today. So, on that note, we'll get started with some introductions. I'm Vann Maxson, Head of Solutions at Intento. I'm focused on helping our customers understand the ins and outs of Intento, and then illustrating how you can leverage AI to get the highest quality MT experience possible. I come from a background of about 15 plus years of localization experience, mostly working in technical project management and solutions. But it turns out I have the least experience of our other great panelists today, so let me introduce them as well. First, we have Carrie Fischer. She's the Globalization Services Manager at Subway, and she's responsible for all globalization related strategies for the company. She has over 30 years of localization experience, a long history there. But she's also on the board of Women in Localization, one of our favorite groups here in the industry. And she's a big advocate of bringing language learning courses back to US schools. And as a part of that, she's a co founder of, I hope I say this correctly, but is it Speak, Carrie?
Yep.
SPEAC? Yeah, Supporting and Preserving Language Education in America Coalition. So super exciting. Glad you're passionate there. And then we also today have John Weisgerber. So John is a battle-tested industry veteran like myself, having gone through a long history of 20 years plus in the industry, working with big global enterprise operations such as HP, working as an operation manager, machine translation developer, and most recently, John's with XTM, leveraging his wealth of knowledge to help support translation management technologies for their customers. So, yeah, looking forward to working through the session with you guys today. So for everyone, as a review of what we're looking to get into, we're going to be diving in and looking at how brands like Subway are using AI to get translation quality that meets their business needs. Super critical function in today's ever-evolving world. But we're going to look at what to consider before bringing AI into your workflows. Of course, AI is everywhere, being pushed by everyone, but how can we do this in a way where we're finding out what content types will we benefit most, how to handle things like data, security, how to manage change management for implementing new technologies, and what's the best way to have the smoothest rollout possible and take advantage of these new technologies to maximize ROI. So, that's the goal today, and we can get started. So, first and foremost, I think it's important that we define what AI delivering ROI really means in localization. What would success look like if we actually did it correctly? So, Carrie, I'm going to come to you first, and we'd like to just discuss how Subway evaluates translation quality. And by Subway, I mean you. And what kind of efficiency and cost effectiveness have you been able to find with AI?
Sure. Well, even before maybe defining AI ROI, maybe we should define what AI is first. So for me personally at Subway, I don't use like LLMs to generate translations. I'm not even sure I would know if one was if I tripped over it, but I do use MT for certain types of content. And the whole reason, of course, for even using MT is to translate like large amounts of stuff in a very short amount of time with cost efficiencies. So personally, I started with knowledge-based articles and e-learning content. That was my first introduction to anything related to MT, and I'm one of the last holdouts, I'm sure. Sun Microsystems, I remember Melissa Biggs was doing this a long, long time ago. So I'm a late adopter. But in my case, success looked like delivering the projects on time, way under what it would have cost me to use professional translations, translators and voice talent. And I continue to see success with good old fashioned MTPE. So I save at least 25% of the costs on every single project I use it on, not to mention shortening lead times and all that stuff. So um, it also means to me, success also means to have everything kind of integrated and optimizing. So having one centralized system for me is key to being efficient. You have for me, I have to have everything in one place. I'm the team of one, classic. Uh, no team to rely on. So success, I think means different things to different people. But if you are constantly learning and trying different things in this AI explosion, then I think you're on the right track. So, John, I know I'm only scratching the surface with my antiquated MT processes. So I'm sure you're seeing clients use AI in many shapes and forms.
Yeah, we are. It's not really all as different as you might think. This is, so it's really interesting when we start talking about AI. You're absolutely correct. MT has always been AI. In the recent last decade, MT has been LLMs. So you are using LLMs, Carrie. You're just using them in a different way. It's
Got
really,
it.
but what's top of mind these days is what they call generative AI, that launched with Chat GPT a couple of years ago, and that's gotten everybody really excited. So it's really interesting to kind of differentiate what has changed with what has not changed. And one of the things that, especially when we're talking about delivering ROI, the thing that has not changed is that nobody can tell you what's right for your content except you, right? You can't measure ROI unless you know what your success criteria are for your content. And that's going to actually vary by lots of different content types within your enterprise. Consumer facing content, websites, marketing, emails, e-learning content, software strings, knowledge bases, support databases, all this stuff is going to have different criteria. Years ago, we were calling that dynamic quality. It's important to recognize that. And then, that's all been standardized and now in the MQM framework. But those just give you the tools for you to decide what success and ROI means for each one of your different content types. And then, your TMSs give you the tools to measure that. But what the new AI really brings that is new is I think it's applicable to more content types than MT traditionally has been. Um, and its ability to learn on the fly. Like when we talk about traditional MT, we're mostly talking about neural machine translation now, because that's about a decade old. And training those systems, you can train them on your content, but it's a big job. It involves a lot of data. So it usually happens like once a year or something like that, where you'll start to see these improvements to the quality of the output of the MT that you leverage for post editing. The new generative AI can learn on the fly from all your validated translations that you've already done. Um, so the learning cycle is much, much faster there, and you get better results sooner. That's fantastic. And also because of its ability to just create or author content based on inputs, we call them prompts, then it's interestingly more applicable to content types that where MT has been excluded. We're talking very fluent marketing content, transcreation, which really just feeds into the goals of, again, the measurements of success for various content types, but like personalization, et cetera, has been the goal for customer facing content for a lot of companies. And the generative AI is going to be able to help you do that much faster, much more productively. But you still have to know what analytics, what data, whether it's inside the TMS in terms of, periodic checks on the LQA, or it's, business success criterion that comes from outside the TMS. Those are your measurements of ROI.
Yeah, that's awesome, John. Thanks for mapping some of that out. And I apologize, I disappeared there for a hot second. So we all deal with technology. But I'm back.
Awed
Um,
into invisibility.
but just to tie on a little bit to what John was talking about, yeah, the recent versions of these large language models and generative AI that came out, really in the last couple of years, is unlocked a whole new section of content that people would have been very hesitant to address before. And we're using even more complex hybrid workflows in order to engage with that content. So, of course, providing traditional draft translation with high quality MT to start with, but then augmenting that further with these new technologies, taking advantage of giving them human readable instructions so we can all operate in our normal minds, but ultimately using that to address some of the areas where MT was traditionally falling short, right? John, you mentioned marketing content. I think that's a classic example of a type of content that people never wanted to use traditional neural machine translation for because it was rigid, it was direct translation, and it required a lot of human effort at the end in order to clean that up. But now with prompting, we can, do transcreation right away, even in language, and then work with additional augmentation after that to, work through cleaning up preferable idioms or doing automatic post editing, or even doing LQAs with the MQM framework. There's a lot of things that can be tackled with this new technology. We're kind of in an exciting time, I think, because there was this hurdle of content that we've been reaching towards, and then all of a sudden with Gen AI, I think it's exploding, right? We're all going to have to deal with a lot more volume in the end, and that's where MT is going to really help at scale, right? Carrie, you found this in your role that at some point there's a mass of content and pressure to get that done cheaper and faster. So really the true solution at scale seems to be leveraging AI to some degree to address that. And then, John, as you're mentioning, having strategies around addressing different types of content, understanding what your success criteria is there or your requirements around the outputs of those, and then designing the appropriate workflows to address that. And then using AI as that tool to really provide ROI enhancement, efficiency, and even more accuracy down the road that perhaps we hadn't had an opportunity to do with earlier technologies. So it's a fun time. Um, Carrie, I know you touched on it briefly. We talked about a few content categories. Are there other specific highlights or even some challenges? You mentioned some experimentation. Can you give us a few examples where AI has been successful, but then potentially wasn't successful in some of the, exploration that you've done?
Sure. So right now, again, using my good old MTPE model. So I always use it on our operations manuals, technical documentation, and even some legal contracts. Sometimes the MT alone is good enough for some of these legal contracts, just because it's what they all kind of have in common is they're rather boring. We're not trying to engage a guest to buy the new footlong nachos, which just came out last week in the US. It's not creative content, which is funny because now I'm hearing, not only from you, but from others that, engaging AI in creative content is now a thing and can be done. But for now, for me, these high volume items, usually, and so between the TM leverage, the savings from NT, and my internal customer satisfaction, so all the departments that I work with, and right now it just works. I have an optimized process. Of course, it can be further optimized always, and it's up to me to be able to be up to date and thinking about how I can constantly improve what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. What I can tell you is I won't use any type of AI translations right now for guest facing content. Again, I think I need to test that again. Um, we really try and connect with guests like on our app. We use very familiar language. We joke in our messaging. I just translated it a couple weeks ago. Hey, your sub looks lonely without a side. Maybe AI would make it funny in French Canadian. I'm not sure, but so in some types of content, we still use the transcreation. Honestly, I find that fascinating. It's a lot of fun to have the interaction with my internal customers and my linguists to come up with something fun. But John, I think I'm probably missing the boat, by not trusting AI right now to do these types of translations for me. I'd love to hear what other people are doing.
Well, last year was the year of finding out whether this AI stuff was really here to stay. I think it clearly is. So now here we are talking about everybody, and every conversation I have all week is, how do I get this stuff in the pipeline now? So there are several use cases that have been proven out. I mean, a lot of even the generative AI right now is still being used in primarily a MT type of role, wherein a translation is produced and then you decide whether it's good or not. Um, as I said before, that the Gen AI can learn on the fly in real time from your existing content. So we're seeing some better results. Van would know this better than me, but we might be approaching a threshold where the Gen AI I think it's still a bit slower than traditional MT. The custom built MT engines are just faster. So these are the things you have to take into consideration, the classic fast versus good versus cheap criterion. That's going to vary by content type. But now the Gen AI can also give you, they can also tell you whether the AI thinks it's good or not. It can give you quality estimation as another classic use case that is one of the more expensive parts of, even if you're going to continue doing PE, post editing, then you can have your linguists focus, instead of having to read everything, decide what they post edit. They can just focus on those that the AI has decided require their attention. The AI can even tell you what they think is wrong with the translation. Um, all of that is still a process that ultimately you're going to have to validate is working for you, and whether or not it's providing you the results that you need. And you'll get that kind of data from your TMS and your analytics. There's a ton of new use cases coming online. The automatic post editing is one people talk a lot about. So again, Gen AI is really good at rewriting text based on some kind of prompt. And if you have text that the AI has decided is not great, then you can tell the AI to fix it based on some types of input. And people are seeing success with that. But the really exciting stuff is, once you've decided that you're getting the good results, then you can just kind of let the AI do its thing. And now we're talking about agentic. I don't like the word agentic, so I keep saying AI agents. But you guys do your thing. And the ability for the AI to just go off and do things without your prompting or without your input. This is exciting stuff.
Yeah. I agree. So John, I'll just follow up on your comments there as well, just because I think that's another area where, while the technology exists, how do we implement it, or where are people addressing some of these issues? I think from an enterprise level, we're seeing a lot more opportunities for people to work in technology. So I think, Carrie, you've been around since the days of like almost paper translation, but you're not that far back. But you know what I mean? There's been a
Yes, I am.
huge there's been a huge change just in
Sure,
the
man.
technology in the industry, right? So from TMS cat tools to now full management systems like we have with XTM, right? That's doing more than just translation. We had base functionality. It's expanded beyond that. Now we're going even deeper using tools, right? So attaching tools to that centralized management content and taking advantage of that. So for us at Intento, our focus is on AI, of course. And AI really is now unlocking the ability to maximize some of the efficiencies that we couldn't do previously, some of the challenges we've had. We've seen a drastic increase in AI performance, right? So machine translation quality, even 5 years ago, people likely would have shied away from it. Now it's becoming more of a mandatory norm, right? And that was in a very short period of time. Not to mention now we have the newer generative AI technologies. And as John mentioned, we're working in a hybrid type workflow situation, and that's done by applying AI through AI agents. And those agents then start addressing specific requirements as taskmasters, right? And allow us to start approaching new requirements that weren't addressable before, just as John was mentioning. So, really understanding those quality needs that you have to have will help planning and dictate how you're going to start investing in AI and what that investment might do to ultimately offset some of the other costs that you have with humans at the moment. Because really, up until now, the only way to address those requirements was through this post editing experience, right? Where we give a set of human readable instructions to people, and they have to go through and manage that content, right? So that's how it was done in the past. Now we have similar solutions that we're replicating with AI. And then, John, just to touch on one other thing that you had mentioned is the personalization. Like, what are we doing to not only um, meet some basic quality requirements, but really introduce brand voice, for example. That's something that enterprises have been focused on for ages. Carrie, you mentioned having at least an informality, for example, with a lot of your customer facing content, which is important. And you have guardrails set up around that to make sure you're doing it, effectively and efficiently. How could AI do something like that that would seem like a totally, human only process in the past? Um,
Mm.
and then the other thing I wanted to mention is that we talked a little bit about content, and I assume, Carrie, when you were mentioning knowledge bases and internal training, your goal there is to include your broader employee base, right? Or your vendor base, where your franchisees likely are coming to you to get that information from all around the world. I think Subway has restaurants everywhere, literally. So not only are you speaking to an American audience, but a global one, and I assume inclusivity and making sure that those trainings and knowledge-based content's effective, so that you have that broad brand, activity that's centralized across the board and inclusive for all of those different regions across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and you know, I think having everything centralized is a huge advantage in getting that global messaging out. And you mentioned brand voice, and I'm just so paranoid about AI kind of going off the rails and coming up with some different brand voice than the 100+ countries that we're in are used to. So I'm still a little skeptical. And then, John, you mentioned agentic. I've never heard of that term before. And that
Made it up, but it sounds
I
cool.
don't think so.
Well,
So
I'm
I
sure
have
that's a bit of an elephant in the room for everyone, right? So if we've
AI
been on
agents.
LinkedIn in the last 6 months, AI agents have been spoken everywhere, likely to the point of mental saturation, I'm sure. As
Not
John
really,
mentioned,
because a lot
just
of us don't know what it is. So I that's, I did, we hosted some Intento ladies at a women in localization panel, women in technology. And AI agents came up and I had never heard of it. I'm like, raise my hand. So can we talk about it here and what it is,
Yeah.
what they are?
Yeah, why don't we give a brief explanation just so we're aligned with everyone on the call today? So at least in our perspective, um, agents in general, when used with AI, are purpose-built taskmasters, essentially. So looking to assign a specific task, whether it's glossary application or maybe automatic post editing, where we want to have a consistent tone of voice. These are some of the more common types of activities that could be addressed with that. But you could also have them act as like a inline workflow LQAer. John, you mentioned the MQM framework. You can develop an agent to run through a quality assurance using that framework and provide back the same information that you'd be getting from a human in that same format that our industry experts are used to, but ultimately having that done in line and automated in a workflow, and those outputs can then be taken and fed into another agent to action on that content. So if we think about various tasks that we require humans to undertake today, it's likely that we can address those on a case-by-case basis by building a customized agent, doing it responsibly, so we're not just blindly applying AI everywhere, but ultimately purpose-built to address requirements that weren't able to be just directly trained into those models in the past.
Is
So
it a
yeah,
prompt?
AI
Are they
agents and
prompts?
so yeah, I mean, ultimately, working with large language models requires a prompt. But the way we look at an agent is going to be something more complex than just either a standard prompt, right? For us, typically, an agent's going to have a multi-stage workflow of its own. So for Intento, the way we approach that is we want to make sure that we have a gatekeeper of sorts that can determine if the AI should action or not. From there, having that AI do that initial activity. So let's just say we're doing tone of voice correction, but sees, let's say we want to have formal tone of voice and it identifies informal, it changes that grammar, then typically we have a review step to check to make sure that it was effectively changed and then pass it on through the rest of the process. So at least 3 steps within that agent to ensure that we're only applying it where needed. Some of these LLMs are, as John mentioned, not always super fast. They may be effective, but they're huge. They take some time still. Um, and also, they're not super inexpensive all the time, right? If we're doing very complex tasks with them, we don't necessarily, and we're talking about translation at scale, we don't just want to blindly apply it to millions and millions of words for no reason and overuse that resource, right? So from an ROI perspective, it's important that we're monitoring how we're using it at scale so that we're doing it effectively from a cost perspective as well. And then, of course, having that final check to make sure that we're avoiding other common things that we see with the new technology, and not necessarily common, but it can hallucinate, for example. It's not perfect. So much like humans, we do want to have a check in there just to make sure that it's operated properly and we have that consistent, reliable, high quality output that we've designed that agent to produce. So hopefully that helps clarify it a little bit for you, Carrie. So we have a good idea there. Um, now, John, I'm gonna pivot to you and talk a little bit how I assume much like as a vendor supplying services to an enterprise like Carrie, for example, we work a lot to consult and strategize with our customers as we often consider them more partners than anything, with a common goal of providing that high quality output. Um, can you talk a little bit about, what you want customers to look at when they're undertaking this dive into AI?
Yeah, sure. There's the for each of your content types, the dreaded Q word has already come up several times, quality, right? People get twitchy when we start talking about quality. It's real and it's one of the pillars and you have to think about it. But I like to, that becomes a painful conversation, and it's often detailed, and you get into the weeds of how do we measure quality. I like to simplify that, not only for our users, but also their bosses, like your executives who you have to prove this to, and just flip that on its head and talk about risk. Instead of quality, talk about risk, right? What are the risks of this particular translation flow not being falling below some threshold, right? There is still risk involved with AI, Gen AI, that Vann already talked about and that Carrie already talked about. It's a little bit different from MT. You know, the history of the evolution of this AI technology through machine translation is the more clever ways we have made this technology produce more fluent and human sounding content, the greater the potential for it to wander off the reservation and do weird things, right? So you need to take that into account for your workflows, but you need to be able to know for each content type kind of where this sits and what your enterprise's you know comfort level is with that kind of risk. I think Carrie explained that we've seen a lot of different approaches to AI in the industry over the last couple of years. Some companies are like, hey, wow, you know, we're not ready to jump into this, while others are like, why haven't we done this yesterday? You may be feeling that pressure now to implement AI. And that just means you have to be able to measure it. So the other, you know, but the other big risk is security, privacy, this, you know, understanding the policies of the AI that you implement, not just the security of data being transferred around, but is your data being trained on that AI? Which of course, ultimately you have to do to make it better. So you need to be figuring all these things out. And then as Vann pointed out, the other big thing becomes like, where are you going to implement this in your enterprise tech stack? You know, the average enterprise, you know, large scale enterprise is probably using 5, 6, 8, 10 different enterprise systems, CRMs, CMSs, software, IDE repos, and goodness knows what else. And every single one of those apps is trying to offer you AI features right now. And if you are like Carrie, because this is the other common thing, even large enterprises will have small localization teams. Carrie is not literally alone because she's going to be working closely with folks like Vann and her LSPs or translation providers in order to manage all this content. So we worry a lot about, oh my God, it's going to put us all out of work. I don't really think that's true. There's just going to be more work to do, and we need to learn the new ways to manage this. But it's not just so enterprises who embark on AI will typically start with they'll get an enterprise account, like this is our customized, we've trained this one. You know, to take a Subway example, we'll get an open AI account, and we're going to customize it with a lot of the content, all the work that Carrie and her teams have already done to get better results. But even still, that's just one AI to plug in, you know, whereas when you get into agents and the things that Vann were talking about, there's going to be a lot of separate LLMs and Gen AI systems working in tandem. XTM has launched one we're calling it language guard, and its sole purpose is to detect inappropriate or offensive languages or instances where the AI might wander off the reservation and do something really weird and hallucinate. We've all heard the stories, right? But that's an entirely separate implementation of an AI, but that's how we have discovered that you, just like almost anything else really, the way you get better, more predictable, reliable results out of a Gen AI system is to customize it for a specific task. Not exactly the definition of agentic that Vann explained, but very similar. So you're going to have multiple AIs for different purposes all over the place. And how do you manage all this stuff? And that's really where the centralized TMS comes in, you know, as Carrie explained. If you got a proper enterprise translation management system, it is the hub that these various content types flow through, and it will assist you in implementing the proper AI for the proper task at the proper stage in the workflow and measuring those results and providing the kind of data that shows you whether you're getting an ROI out of it.
Yeah, I think those are those are a few really valid touch points you talked about there, John. I do want to back up a little bit to one point where you were talking specifically about safety and security, because I think it was a hot topic for a while, right? Because of how these models were originally created, like the
Yeah.
internet, here we go. Which also, and I think the other thing, a word we've used a lot is risk. But really in localization, that's what we're trying to do, right? We're generating new language and reducing risk as much as possible so that language is as effectively as received as it can be. So whether we're working at an LSP doing risk management, which I think is half the job in that industry of trying to make sure the outputs are high quality. Um, Around that, though, there's other considerations, I think, from the enterprise perspective. And I think, and Carrie, I'm going to come to you in just a second about this. Um, when you were onboarding your AI solution, did you follow standard enterprise IT protocol and onboarding a new vendor where they went through and did these full security checks to make sure that, hey, Intento's not just making this up, it actually meets our standards and requirements? And you would have to go through the same thing with a vendor like XDM. Is their software providing safe, secure, reliable place for me to complete my work? And does it fall within the guardrails that Subway as a company has put in, not just for you specifically in localization, but kind of as an enterprise vehicle itself?
For sure. It's pretty rigorous and it takes a lot of time. That's what I remember. Um, we have, a chief security officer. Gosh, I remember when I implemented XTM 8 years ago. It took a while, and because Subway, before me, Subway didn't have a me, right? They just kind of everyone did their own thing. Um, Using various vendors that were approved or not approved, right? It was nuts. So after it centralized with me, I knew I had to find a system that was going to work for us. And so the CSOD had no idea what a TMS was. So it was a long, explanation of what it is, how it's going to benefit Subway. He got it. It took a trip down to Miami to meet him, but that's okay. Miami's nice. And explaining in person what this was, and then he felt comfortable. But and it was the same, with Intento. So it's a technical review because Subway needs to understand what I wanted to implement and why, and the benefits. And but yeah, it's a very long process. I do think actually. So I kind of helped, I think, Subway kind of get into the AI mode, of thinking. And when I started to look at automated post editing, so AI having do the post edit instead of a person, um, it brought up the subject of AI. And so I reached out to our chief human resources officer, and I said, what's our stance? What can we use AI? I don't even know, because I'd like to run this pilot. And there was just I didn't mean to cause a stir, but at least now we have a policy. We never even had a policy before. I think last year 2024 was our first AI policy, and it's up, on the intranet for everyone to see. But yeah, it goes through a rigorous review before anything gets implemented. So it's like, onboarding an LSP is a piece of cake, but onboarding technology is not.
Right. And now it's such a critical factor for everyone. But I think it's important. I wanted to touch on that just because, for other potential brand managers or localization folks on the customer side, there tends to be a bit of fear there, but ultimately, I think it's important to understand there's already guardrails in place typically that you have to follow anyway. And they do capture those critical requirements in ensuring safety and security when you're doing that AI onboarding. I'm sure John has stories of going through certain security checks and processes. We do it for all of our customers as well. So it's something that we as vendors have become very accustomed to, especially now in the world of AI, where even that becomes another factor that we have to validate. So hopefully, just letting our friends know that there can be some comfort there. Your business is set up to ingest these systems. You just have to follow the proper guidelines, make sure you're doing it responsibly. And I think that goes back to AI adoption and key strategies. So, John, just before we got a couple more minutes about, and I think you can talk a little bit more about what are some of these key strategies to make sure that that AI adoption is successful. I know we talked about having a centralized system, which helps make management of those resources much more effective. Were there any other points you wanted to address there as well?
Yeah, I mean, we've covered a lot of the basics. Like you got to know what ROI is. The centralized TMS is going to give you the tools to measure that and validate that you are meeting that ROI. And that also means on an ongoing basis, right? Uh,
Yeah.
the otherwise, I would say, start small, right? Pick a likely, based on what you've learned about what AI can do, um, pick a likely content type that you think it might be a good fit for and give it a shot, right? Define your ROI, test it and measure it. This can be challenging for people. It's extra work, right? But it's something you're gonna have to do. So Carrie's already done it a couple times. And as you like the pace of innovation in AI is only accelerating right now. We're talking about agents, and next month it's going to be something else. So testing and validating that you're meeting your ROI goals on a given content type is something that you're going to need to be able to do because nobody else can answer that question really but you. Setting up the goals, right? The TMS gives you the tools to set up a process that will measure that goal. I get this question all the time we're a TMS provider. We make technology with all these tools in it. And people come to me and say, well, which MT should I use? Which AI should I use? And which is the best for this language pair? And I have to tell them it depends, man. That's on your content and what your goals for that content are. And all these other factors that we've been talking about. And I understand the frustration when they go, oh my goodness, I don't have, Carrie doesn't have a testing team unless it's an LSP. Like you can
Yep.
outsource this work. That comes at a cost and that factors into everything else, right? But if you've ever managed an ISO quality management system, I've done it. I don't necessarily wish that on anybody, but it's an instructive exercise. There's a concept that they're calibrating your tools, right? You have to always calibrate your tools to know whether the measurements you're getting are any good. So when people ask me these questions and I say, well, you tell me, and they go, I don't have the time or the resources to figure it out. I say, call Vann, call Intento. That's what they do. They will do that for you. But again, it's a service that comes at a cost. But so starting small, just building these muscles to be able to set up and run a test and try it out. But your normal, as Carrie already explained, your normal kind of standard change management strategies apply. There are stakeholders, uh, and get them involved, get them excited. Like this is exciting stuff, and the ability and lessen the concern that anybody's like, I mean, not the executive level, but that anybody's losing their job. Because always remember the true golden rule of localization, which is if you do it successfully, you're just going to get a lot more of it. So you can look at, like Carrie said, you can look at any given process. Look, we introduced MT, we're doing stuff faster and we're doing it cheaper. Well, that's great. Guess what that means? They're going to take the rest of that budget and say, let's do it in 35 other markets and get the same results, right? So successful localization begets even more localization. So it's really just a matter of managing this flood of content that's going to be coming your way, and you need the technology to do it. So learn how to manage it, practice, start small, find success, and get everybody, jazzed about reducing their workloads and their stress levels through
Yeah.
AI.
There's no stress in localization.
So you don't look like me after you've been doing this for 20 odd years.
Yeah, so just to touch a little bit on the AI strategies, before we go into our final kind of talking point question and then into Q&A. So of course we have the technology strategy, decision-making process at the enterprise level, consulting with your technology vendors on how to approach new technologies. And then for us, working in that new technology space, we apply a lot of best practices to ensure that we're taking advantages of what is available today. So first and foremost, talking about customization of AI where possible to meet those high requirements that we need for content. As mentioned in the past, may not have been achievable, but now we can successfully start moving the needle forward on ROI by implementing high quality, customized, personalized MT, right? But then from there, what's next? So we know already that so much changes, not just annually, but even on a monthly basis. We're seeing new models come onto the market. They may have new advantages, new things that we can approach. So for us, it's really important to understand that AI really is a tool, right? And if we're using it as a tool, it's important that, we maintain that tool and make sure that it's still operating effectively over time, which for us in localization means constant improvement, whether that's by maintaining your translation memories in XTM, critical factor in maintaining your translation quality, leveraging that same material to ensure that you're consistently updating your models, for example, but then also having the ability to onboard new AI technologies as they become available. Carrie, I know you and I have worked together on a few projects that were unsuccessful. We tried early on to do a few of these things with AI, and at the time, the models just weren't quite producing the outputs that we had liked. And part of that was two-factor. One, we tried some languages that might have been not common, but required, right? So even though it was a challenging choice, we did that on purpose because we wanted to know outside of English, which is kind of the base language, what languages actually work. And we'll bring that up in a little bit because it's one of the questions that we received today. So we'll address that shortly. Um, but then also just looking at this continuous improvement model. I think that's always the goal when we're talking about localization is structuring our workflows that they're effective today, but planning for tomorrow to make sure that as we're getting pushed to either adopt more AI, become more efficient, if that's coming from pressures of upper management or just personal goals, and then also maintaining and improving that workflow over time to continue to produce higher quality outputs and maximize ROI are critical factors in success of not just working with AI itself, but managing that within a controlled system, being able to take on new technologies or work with partners within your organization with something you may not have even thought about localizing before. And I think, Carrie, we just had an opportunity to do that with one of your teams and work in a tool that, beforehand you had no involvement in for the most part. And now it becomes part of your attention set that you're working on in localization. So now it's part of your purview. So exciting opportunities within the interest within the industry now that we're seeing with AI. So just really quickly, as we transition into questions, um, Carrie and John, what are some of the things you're excited about that we're seeing? So just really quickly, what might be one or two things that you haven't been able to tackle yet that with new technologies you're excited to potentially try?
Well, I mean, it's all about experimenting with the new technologies. I attend every single free event that I possibly can, just to learn, what else I need to think about. So I don't know what's exciting yet. I have to figure. it's still very overwhelming for someone like me who's not technology oriented, so to speak. I remember calling myself a technology toddler at an XTM Live many years ago, and I'm still kind of in the fetal position when it comes to Gen AI. But I think it's exciting. Somebody once told me that, at some point you're not going to need content writers anymore at Subway. It's all going to be AI. And I said, "Are you nuts? That's never going to happen." She said, "Well, it's like a toddler driving a car. You're not going to do it now, but eventually the car is going to drive itself." So it's coming. I think we just need to embrace it
Yeah.
and see how how we can harness it. Right? I hate that word, but how we can use it to our benefit.
Yeah. Great. And John, how about you? I know you work in a little bit more of a, kind of a middleware space in a certain degree where we're doing technology connection and things like that. However, you guys are even starting to use AI as well. Are there other avenues that you're excited to explore, or potentially XTM might be looking at in the future?
I mean, I hope I'm not contradicting myself when I say that I'm excited about the AI agents. I just don't like the word they've chosen. You know, it was almost a year and a half ago, which is generations of an ancient history in the AI world, but I embarrassed myself thoroughly at a localization technology roundtable event, a room full of 30 people like yourselves, experienced technology professionals. I asked a poorly worded question. We're talking about Gen AI, and I just kind of said, but what can it do? Right? And everybody looked at me like I sprouted a tail because we just spent a day and a half talking about what it does. We all know what it does, but what I meant was, right now it's just doing all the same. What I meant then was right now it's just doing all the same stuff. It's like an MT. It's kind of a black box. You might get better results, you might not. You're still probably going to post edit it because you're not sure the answers. And I'm like, what can it actually? I want to see it actually do things, and that's what agents are showing promise of doing. You know, as a
Yeah.
forget translation, as a person who works in XTM day in and day out, managing translation flows, what can the AI actually do for me to make my job easier, faster, more productive? And that's what the agents are doing. Like we've seen examples in the market so far, like it's making bad dinner reservations for Michael McConaughey or whatever it's doing. We've seen these, but I mean that's kind of remarkable. It's going to get better, but it's where agents offer the promise to actually interact with an application in a very natural dialogue sort of way and have it actually do things instead of, yeah, I'm still just typing a lot and clicking on buttons. Anyway, but so the agents I think offer enormous amount of promise, and pretty excited about that.
Yeah, having transitioned from an LSP to a AI tech company, I've been drinking from the fire hose for 4 years now. So
Yep.
even for me, being directly in the space, it's a constant learning and transitional period and localization, I think, which is exciting. Having worked in some of the more traditional mindsets, I think one of the things we're seeing, and Carrie and John, you both expressed this, is just open-mindedness, which is something that was the opposite of what we were trying to do in the past, which was trying to regulate everything into these perfect translations. And now we're finding new ways to do that, which I think is super exciting. Okay, I'm going to jump into questions, and we'll knock these out. We don't have too many, which is why I pushed and added a little bit more time for us to be able to converse. So the first one here, how to use, yeah, so there is a poll here. I forgot to mention this. So I'll go through the questions. There is a pop-up. Would you like to know more about XTM or Intento solutions? If yes, just click yes, submit the poll, and we'll reach out to you and set up some time to
Foot
have
long
a deeper
nachos.
discussion. Yeah,
Don't forget the foot
exactly.
long
That would
nachos.
be awesome. So let me go to the first question, which just says how to use auto QA function within XTM to avoid post edit for passing content or segments through. So do we have a way right now where the auto QA function is benefiting by helping with some post edit reduction, John?
It is, but to be perfectly honest, this is an evolving feature in XTM. If you're a current XTM user, you might be scratching your head a little bit, but look for big new announcements in the very near future. So this is definitely a strategy and an approach. We've got kind of the rudiments of this in place already, but we're rapidly building this technology out. So we're calling it another fun acronym. Everybody knows CAT, I guess, CAT tools, computer assisted translation. I think we're still calling it computer assisted review, but it's a theme of when you're going to have a human in the loop, allow the human to only focus on those texts that the AI has decided require their attention.
Awesome. Yeah, so I guess we'll check that one off for now, and we'll move on to the next one just because we're quickly winding down here. So let's go with so there's a couple of these that are similar, but I think we can address them together. So we have one talking about use cases, so post-edit quality evaluation, and the question is, can they be applied to all target languages, or is it restricted to English? So I'm going to start with this one and just say that from an AI perspective, we understand that not all AI is built equally. Models still operate differently in respect to language, and it all comes from the data that's been trained into them. Newer models still suffer from the same setbacks that traditional models would, just in the fact that there's less content available for them to be trained on. So I do think I'm going to click done here and bring up the follow-up question, which again is talking about using LLMs for representing different languages and data sets. This one's specifically about training, but it falls into the same category. So Carrie, as we talked about originally, we had done some languages.
Yeah.
One was more successful than the other, I think, and that's because we picked a high resource language and a lower resource language because we wanted to know what those capabilities are. So I would say the key factor here is understanding that no, AI isn't going to reach every language perfectly today. It'll continue to improve, and as more content is generated and as those models get retrained, we're going to see improvements in language experience in more languages as we go. One could also argue domain quality also falls into the same category, right? As we get outside of the general internet and colloquial domains, we do a lot of benchmarking and testing at Intento to see what the quality of those base models is for that specific reason. We have customers that vary from regulated industries to commercial and all over the place, and all of them have different requirements. So it's important, again, we talked about this, to understand what your requirements are, have the ability to iterate and test with AI to make sure it's working for you, and then have the ability then to take on the new technologies as they arrive to tackle some of those areas that we weren't able to address before. I think that's pretty critical. So yeah, we have definitely done some of that benchmarking and testing. We put out an annual report in Intento that goes through that. We'll be releasing ours in the next couple of months that has the 2025 information. That's a great starting point when you're exploring the quality of these models.
And I just want to mention the two languages that
Carrie.
I did do. And it was this was 2 years ago, and we piloted automated post editing for German output and Polish output. German was like meh. Polish was not good. So not why I picked those languages, I don't know. I think my mindset was, well, if it's going to work for Polish, it's going to work for anything. if I had tried Spanish or French, I'm guessing I would have had a different outcome. So it's all about testing and retesting, because it's, that was 2 years ago, and I'm sure it's come leaps and bounds ahead. So
All right. We are at time. There are a few questions that we didn't get to, but hopefully we at least touched on some of these topics. Really appreciate everyone joining today. Hopefully you'll have the ability to reach out to us individually. I'm sure you can track us down on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to us, have a conversation. We're all happy to chat with people. But John, Carrie, thank you so much for joining today. It was a great conversation. And hopefully we've encouraged people to get a little bit more open-minded about AI and how they can tackle some of their ROI and some of that pressure that they get from, whether it's upper management, increased content, or just trying to keep up with the technology of today. It's all exciting. So really appreciate your time today, everyone.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you for
yeah,
hosting.
thank you.